Hello everyone, I'm going to be going over how to replace a green screen wall or any background with your own. In this case, I'm going to be using an image from Pixabay because they're royalty free and they're images where we don't have to worry about the copyright, but it's always better to use your own if that's an option. But if you are grabbing something from Pixabay, I recommend heading over to the Photos tab and searching for the location you'd like to replace. So I am going to look for a beach photo. Now, the first row and sometimes the last row are all sponsored images that you need to pay for, so you need to ignore those. And then choose whichever location you like the look of. Something to think about as you're choosing a photo is just the lighting. It always is easier to composite different images together when the lighting is similar between the two, so the light source is coming from the same sort of direction. I know in our class photos, there's some lights coming from the side and also above, so we're not going to get something absolutely perfect, but I'll go with this one. So when you click on a photo, you can come over to the green download button. We don't need to sign in, but we can't choose the largest size because that does require an account. But if we go with the second largest, we can download an image of a decent size. Sometimes it'll ask you to allow downloads from Pixabay, and if it does, just say yes. Once that's ready, we're going to head over to Affinity Photo. So if you press F4 and start typing the word photo, it'll pop up. It has this purple icon. You can also press Command Space and search for either Affinity or Photo, and it'll pop up. Now, when you first open Affinity Photo, it usually has this little window here where you can see some lessons, there are some templates, things you've worked on recently, there are a bunch of presets so you can create a new blank document, and then we can also open existing images. So I'm going to be grabbing the class photo, and I've blurred the faces just for privacy reasons here. I'm going to do a quick overview of the workspace. If you've used Affinity Designer, you'll notice that it's very similar. We have a toolbar on the left. Anywhere there is a triangle in the bottom corner means there are additional related tools hiding underneath that you can change between. Depending on which tool is active, there are different properties for the tool that are over here. We have different personas that are optimized for different behaviors. The photo persona is the one we're going to be sticking with for this, but we also have a liquefy, which lets you do some pretty cool warping. We have develop for making corrections to the image if there are issues with the lighting and things like that. Tone mapping, which we're not going to need, and then exporting when we have a version that we want to share with somebody else. So back over to the photo persona. There are some other commonly used tools and actions across the top. Then we have the sidebar, histogram, access to colors, our layers, brushes, and so on. Down at the bottom, we have the navigator, which lets us zoom in and out and pan around. We can type a specific number to get back to a specific level of zoom. With the magic mouse, you can also hold the Option key and just drag, or just drag to pan. So a few ways we can change what we're looking at. There's also a history panel so that we can go back any number of steps with the slider or by clicking on it, or just Command Z for the shortcut on the Mac. All right, I'm going to go through and start showing you the different selection tools to help us remove the background. So first up, we have the rectangular marquee tool. So just really box select. I know I don't need anything this top edge, so I'm just going to select that. And with my layer selected so that it's blue, I can delete it and Command D whenever I want to deselect something. Now I do want to mention the select tools all have these different modes. This first mode, each time you click and drag, it makes an entirely new selection. But we can add to the selection, we can subtract from the selection, and we can make a selection just where two selections intersect. I find that one the least helpful, but the add and subtract modes in particular can be really great. Now, underneath the rectangular marquee tool, there are some other shapes. So ellipses, columns and rows, or freehand. The freehand has a couple different modes. There's literally a freehand mode where you can just sort of draw, and when you get back to the start, it makes your selection. Again, we can have new selections, we can keep adding, we can subtract and intersect. Add and subtract, again, are probably going to be the most useful. Polygon is like working with a pen tool. If you've used one before, you can click, you can even sort of draw with it, and then click back to the start to create the selection. The last one is magnetic, and so you click wherever you want to start, and then you let go and just sort of drag, and notice it's sort of following the silhouette based on areas of contrast. And if I click back at the start, that gets me my selection. So it can be a little hard to control, but you can use those same modes with that as well. Next up, we have flood select or magic wand in a lot of places. Again, I can keep adding to the selection. With the magic wand, the tolerance is really important. So if the tolerance is too high, it might select more than I actually want. If the tolerance is too low, it's going to select very small areas at once. So often it's a matter of adjusting the tolerance and sort of going around and continuing to add to the selection. So you can see it doesn't take too long to get a selection that's not bad at all using the flood select option. I do want to mention a couple of other things here. Contiguous versus not contiguous matters because contiguous just means it has to be touching. If it's not contiguous, it might be grabbing that color from anywhere, which sometimes can cause unintended issues. So I usually keep it contiguous, but you can sort of experiment with that. I'm just going to deselect. Next up, we have the selection menu. So notice we can select all, also with Command A, or deselect with Command D. We can invert a selection, so we reverse it so whatever was outside is now selected. We can select specific color ranges like the greens. You can see this is actually selecting probably way more than I actually want. I can select a sampled color, which is very much like using the magic wand. There's this little slider over here for the tolerance, so I can increase or decrease that and then apply it if I want to. I'm going to cancel and just deselect. Lastly, we have the brush selection tool. It just has an add and subtract mode. Right now it's snapping to edges and it's keeping those edges soft instead of hard. So they're not going to be jagged. And I can either just click or click and drag, and it sort of depends on the area that I'm working with, which one is going to be helpful. You can see that sometimes it's maybe going a little bit further than I might want it to. And so then you can just subtract and grab the areas that went the wrong way. And I can use any of these selection methods. It doesn't really matter which one. I don't need a perfect selection at this point. I just want a selection that's pretty close. And you'll notice areas of high contrast are going to work a little bit easier with a lot of these selection methods. Okay, so that's a really good starting point for the selection. I do want to mention if you're ever mid-selection and you're not finished and you want to save it for later, you can just come into the selection menu, save selection as spare channel. So now if I save my file and come back into it, as long as I save it properly, I can come over to the channels, right click on spare channel, and load to pixel selection to get back to my selection. So that's just something that's super helpful. I do want to mention when you save, it should ask you to either save flattened or save as. You want the save as option so that it actually saves that spare channel with the selection. If it saves flattened, you're going to lose your selection. So save as. If this option doesn't come up, just use save as instead. All right, so I have a selection that I'm decently happy with, but I might want to make some corrections too. So up in the middle here, we have this mask mode, and I'm just going to zoom in with the option key. And if I switch to the brush tool with the little red handle here, I can use my colors. I'm adding to the mask and removing from the selection. When I'm working with white, I'm removing from the mask and I'm adding to the selection. So it's just a matter of going back and forth and just coming in and correcting any areas that seem off. Maybe there's something that seems a little jagged. Maybe there's just a small area that got missed from the original selection. And so it's just a matter of going around, refining any edges that seem a little bit off. You might need to adjust the brush as you're going. I like to keep the hardness on the lower side, but for the most part, it's just minor refining for any areas that I think look a little bit off. And if there happens to be anywhere where the mask goes too far, I can switch it to white and go like that. So I think this selection is looking pretty good. Maybe a little bit more on the edge over here. But when you get to a point where you feel like you're done with the selection, it's grabbing all the areas that you want, you can exit mask mode. And then from here, I could, when I have my background layer selected so that it's blue, just delete the background and we can see how that's looking. Now, there are a few areas where I might want to go back in and make changes. Now, because I had soft edges selected, notice that the edges do actually look soft. There are a couple other things that we can do to refine the edges as well, and this may or may not be necessary depending on what your edges look like. In the select menu at the bottom, there are several things we can do. We can make the selection a little bit smaller or a little bit bigger, depending on whatever we're trying to change. Sometimes giving yourself a little extra space around the edge is good. Sometimes your selection just needs to be a little bit smaller. So you can make it a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller, apply it if you want to, or cancel it if you're like, no, I don't actually need to make that change. Feathering is going to give you a soft, transparent edge. So it's going to gradually have this transparent gradient that fades out. So if you do a really high number and then delete, notice how soft those edges look. It can really help your image combination feel like there's a dream or a memory, just sort of super nostalgic feeling. But you can see that's not going to be a super realistic combination. So I'm just going to undo that with Command Z. Usually, if you want to have a realistic combination of images, combination of layers, you'll probably just want to feather a small amount, somewhere from even 0.5, maybe as high as 10, depending. In my case, because I had the soft edges for the selection, I don't need any feathering, but I could do a smaller amount if I wanted to. I can also smooth the edges of the selection. You'll notice if you try to smooth too much, you lose the detail of the selection. So again, this is something where a small number is often going to give you a better effect than a particularly high number. So you can sort of experiment and see what ends up looking right. Mine's smooth enough, so I'm going to ignore it, but I could apply it. And then lastly, refining the edges lets you do several of these things at once. So I can smooth, I can feather, a couple other things I can do, and then I can apply it. I'm happy with my edges already, so I'm just going to ignore that. So at this point, I'm just going to delete, Command D to deselect. At this stage, if there are any remnants of the photo that are visible, just go in with the eraser tool. And you can change the size of the eraser if you need to, or maybe in this case, the rectangular selection might be a little bit faster. Command D whenever you want to deselect. So from here, I'm going to open up my background image. So I can either go to File, Open, or I can just use the shortcut Command O. I'm going to go to my Downloads folder and open the image that I had previously so I can go back and forth between my two tabs. Now, I'm going to be moving one image into the other, and the direction only matters in terms of the size. We don't want to be making any of our images larger because then we lose quality, so it's always better to shrink things. So whichever image is bigger, that's the one I want to actually move. So when I'm looking at the navigator, I can see what each image looks at like at 100%. And so the background in this case is definitely bigger, so I'm going to be copying that one over. So it should be Command A to select all, Command C to copy, and then Command V to paste. Now, there are a couple of problems here. The image is a lot larger, so I'm going to need to fix that, and I'm going to use the Move tool to do so. So I can grab from the corners to keep the aspect ratio locked. If I don't, I might sort of distort the image. The order is wrong, so I'm going to drag and drop. Notice that thin highlight, that means I'm moving the layer order. And so maybe I want to resize this to fit perfectly. Maybe I want to change what part's visible. Sort of a matter of personal preference, what you go with. So I'm going to do maybe something like that. Not a lot of the beach visible, but that's okay. Now, there are several ways we can make the pictures feel more integrated together. When I have my background layer selected, we actually have lots of layer blending modes. So if I just arrow through, we can see what these look like. Some image combinations having a different blending mode actually can make it look more like it belongs in the same place. A lot of the time, though, it might make it look like there's some sort of filter going on or that it's a hologram or something. So in this particular combination, I don't think any of the blending modes are actually going to help out. So I'm just going to leave this set to normal. However, there are a bunch of adjustment layers down below that I can use. So over here, the little circle that's half black, half white across the diagonal have lots of things that we can adjust. Levels are generally for black and white photos, though some people will use it for color. There's a waveform that shows what the darks and lights and the colors are doing. We can control the black level, the white level, but generally speaking, you want those located on the edges of the main waveform, and I don't think this really needs any changing in this particular case. So I'm just going to delete that and undo adding it. Now, when we're working with color images, often we'll add curves. Again, we have a waveform in a different form, and we have this line. And if we drag it just a little bit up or a little bit down, we can make the image just a little bit lighter or just a little bit darker. So if your image is too light or too dark, you can just do a slight shift to correct that. Now, if you do an extreme shift, notice that it's going to start getting some very interesting effects. And I can just delete the point on the curve if I don't need it. So again, to be realistic, probably a little bit high or a little bit low, nothing extremely extreme. Now right now, if I close out of here, I can get back to it just by clicking on the icon. But right now, this is applying to both of my photos. Maybe I just want it to apply to my background image. So if I select both of these layers, I'm just holding down on Shift and clicking to select over in the Layers panel, or I could do Command and that should work as well. Command G is the shortcut to make a group. Now, if I expand the group, the curves adjustment is only impacting the class photo. And maybe I actually want to go a little bit lighter instead of a little bit darker. Other things that can help make your images feel more cohesive: color balance is one of the most useful adjustment layers. So this is targeting either the shadows, the midtones, or the highlights. I can skew the colors strongly one direction or another, depending on how I want things to look. Maybe I want to go a little away from green because of the reflection of the green screen wall. But maybe because of the setting, I want to go a little bit more towards blue and just cool down the color temperature. I might do that for the shadows, the midtones, and the highlights, going a little bit away from green, going a little bit more towards blue. Maybe I went too much away from green. Maybe I want to go just a little bit closer. Highlights, a little bit away from green, a little bit more towards blue, a little bit more towards blue. And so now if I turn the color balance on and off, you can see that really cooled down the colors a lot, which may feel more appropriate with the background. And if I'm like, I went too far one direction, maybe I want to pull away from the magenta, I can always come back and make changes. And if I don't need to see them, I can just minimize the group. So that's something that's really helpful. So all sorts of different adjustment layers you can experiment with. Now I'm going to click on the class photo, and there are just two last tools I wanted to show. So underneath the eraser tool, we have this tool that looks like a little microphone, and this is the dodging tool. Dodging is a term that comes from film photography when you're working in the darkroom and there's an enlarger shining light through your negative onto your photosensitive paper, and otherwise you're in the dark. And the amount of light determines how dark the image gets or the paper gets. And so sometimes you need to dodge the light to have the area end up a little bit lighter. In this case, maybe not exactly what I want. So I'm just going to undo all that dodging. So dodging, like the color balance, is targeting either the shadows, the midtones, or the highlights. But if you want to make something lighter, choose the range that you're targeting, and then with the tool, just paint on top of it. Now, you will notice that if you're protecting the hue versus if you're not, you will sometimes get a very different result. So that is just something to be aware of. Now, in this particular case, I don't feel like there's anything that I necessarily really strongly want to get lighter, so I'm going to leave the dodging alone. Underneath the dodge tool, if we do a long hold, we also have the burn tool, and this does the opposite. It lets you add additional light where you need light to make something darker. So there are some pretty strong highlights over here, but in the photo it doesn't look like there's light coming from that side. So I can go in and just tone down those highlights in the areas where I think they're too strong. Again, protecting the hue versus not is going to give a different result. I can play around with the brush size, the hardness, all of those sorts of things, but it just is a subtle effect. And if I go back in the history, you can see just makes those highlights a little bit more subtle. Now, I do have some areas that are maybe a little bit green around the edge when I zoom in and look closer. So if that's something that bothers me, I can always just go in with the eraser, maybe with a lower hardness to keep the softness of the edges. And I can just go in and erase anything that I want to remove from the original photograph. And so if I spent more time getting a perfect selection ahead of time, I wouldn't need to do anything here. But if there are areas that just feel like they're a little bit wrong, you can go in, touch them up, remove them, and when you zoom out, you'll see a better result. So lots of things we can do to help the pictures feel a little bit better integrated together. And again, when you don't have the faces all blurred out, this will definitely look better. Definitely keep zooming in and looking closely, seeing if there are areas you really want to go and touch up. You can, of course, change the size of the brushes and the various tools when you need to, depending on what you have going on. So when you get to a point where you feel like you've done everything that you want to do, you have nice edges, your pictures feel as integrated as they're going to feel, then we can come over to the export persona, and I'm just going to click over on the slice panel over here on the combined image, and I can set a format here if I want to. JPEG is totally fine. If I want the whole image, I can just click on this little arrow right here and then export it wherever I want to export it to. Downloads is fine, and always use our standard naming format. So first name, initial of the last name, then your class block like C blue, and then a descriptive name. So when you're all set, you can click on export and it'll save for you in that location so that you can turn it in. I'm just going to cancel. And when you're done, you do want to save your file. Again, if it ever asks you save flattened versus save as, choose the save as option so that you can get back and make edits to your layers, to your adjustment layers, and all of those sorts of things. But otherwise, that's it for today.